Hi, I'm Pam Brown, Pinellas County's Urban Horticulture Extension Agent through the University of Florida. Today we're going to talk about vegetable gardening. It's a very popular topic these days. The Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide contains a wealth of information about the vegetables that are best to plant and when to plant them. We'll tell you how to get a copy at the end of this program. In our first segment, John will talk about nutgrass and composting. Nutgrass is a perennial weed that needs to be addressed when preparing for your vegetable garden. It can become a pervasive problem if you don't. He will also discuss the benefits of compost and the process for creating your own. It's a great soil amendment for Pinellas County's infertile sandy soils.
How many of you have vegetable gardened here in Florida? Put your hands up successfully. Uh-oh. I saw a bunch of hands that were up and then down. So I'll give you a chance. How many of you have tried to garden vegetables here in Florida and you did okay, sort of, but you end up quitting? Okay, very good. And how many of you have never tried and have no clue? Come on, admit it. A fair number, okay? I think in the latter two groups, what I'm going to try to do for you is tell you what I would do if I were getting ready right now to go home and start vegetable gardening. And that means getting ready for the fall. It's hard to grow things here in the summer because of the heat and humidity, but now is the time of the year and also the last couple of months to prepare for what you're going to do in the fall. The seasons here are different than those if you've gardened up north. The soil is different, the bugs are different, and the problems that you run into are different. So this will be for your first summer in a kind of a simple approach. That's a reference to the book again. And I want to thank the extension here and IFAS for their support. This is what we have as a to-do list. And what I want to do is divide it up into three parts: look before you leap, compost how now, and as to soil preparation. So we'll start with look before you leap. We're going to talk about sandy soil, nutgrass, and utilities. Does that look familiar to anybody? And there's a little bit of grass in the upper left corner there, and you see this white, gray, sandy soil. Okay? And you may be familiar with it. You hit it with water, and the water beads up. You keep watering it, and eventually the water goes in, and then fairly soon after that, it's dry again. Maybe you tried to plant a garden in there, like I know some of you did. The first year, you kind of did okay. You thought, well, it's not so hard to garden here in Florida, and you got vegetables, and you were pretty happy. The next gardening season, no, so-so, not bad. In the third year or third season that you tried to plant vegetables, nothing. Does that sound familiar? This we can fix. This is easy to fix. The sandy soils have normally a low amount of organic matter. Organic matter, things derived from living animals, plants, insects, etc. What you want is about 4 times that much that's in sandy soil. So when you gardened, you basically used up the nutrients and the organic matter, and that's why it went kaput on you. Does that look familiar to anybody? I hear some oh yeses and kind of moany sounds. When you look at that, you'll see some grass-like things, kind of a lightish green, and you can still see the gray or the white sandy soil. And if you look, you not only see one, but there are multiple there, okay? And this we can deal with, but it's a problem. And that's what we're going to talk about next. That's nutgrass, okay? There are a lot of names for it, nutgrass, nut sedge, and different ways to spell even those names. This is not a grass, it's a sedge. And there aren't any nuts, there are tubers. So we ought to call it tuber sedge. You can see that they propagate themselves with underground runners called rhizomes. And they make chains underneath the soil. There's two kinds, purple, and the little rhizomes, the little tubers, are kind of fuzzy looking, have little spidery kind of things coming off of them, whereas the yellow nutgrass has little blackish rounded things that are hard. And the problem is, if you pull up on them, you leave tubers behind. The tubers is where the new growth comes from. In fact, if you look very carefully on the purple in the insert there, you see a little white stem going up to make another plant. So unless you do something to get rid of the tubers, you're not going to get rid of the nutgrass. It loves moisture and heat. There aren't any herbicides that you can spray into a vegetable garden with the exception of Roundup. All the others are designed or intended only to be used for your yards, and that means spraying them isn't totally effective either, because you still don't kill the tubers. So the question is, do you have this nutgrass stuff? If you're not sure, find out for sure, because it will matter to you. Dig up several pieces of it and bring it into the extension here and let them look at it, and they can tell you for sure whether that's what you're looking at. There are a lot of plants in the sedge family particularly that look like nutgrass. If you have it growing in your grass, it's going to have a lighter green blade to it. You may not know that you have nutgrass until you've lifted up the regular turf, and maybe you've found some of the little nuts or the shaggy nuts. Like I said, if you're not sure, bring it in, let the extension help you. Rats, you got nutgrass. Otherwise, you're okay. If you've got nutgrass, there are several possible considerations. One is put your garden somewhere else. Somewhere else on your property, hopefully. And again, you'll need full sun. You need a place that doesn't hold water after a heavy rain, well drained. You do need a source of fresh water near you, and you don't want to use reclaimed. Places do in other parts of the country, according to what Pam tells me, but reclaimed water is not approved for vegetable gardens here in Florida. Another option is pot gardening. Any kind of a container with an open top, open mouth, if you will, that has drainage holes in the bottom can be used for pot gardening. Another thing you could do is put down a heavy bottom, like a pond liner, or a piece of plywood. No holes, no cracks, because nutgrass will come up through any little crack, okay? And once you got it, and it's a problem. The polyethylene ground cloth fabric that you could buy locally won't work. Nutgrass comes right up through it. So this is a problem. Make a raised bed on that kind of a bottom. Maybe use 2-inch southern pine. The plywood would rot. The sides will rot eventually, but meanwhile you've had a good time gardening and you can always do it again next to it. Elevated bed means the same sort of a bed as the raised bed, but put it up on top of sawhorses or some support, a table, concrete blocks. There you do need drainage that comes out the bottom, like 1/4-inch holes every 6 inches. Both the raised bed and the elevated bed also give you options in terms of what your mix is, whether it's sterile or not, depending on what you put in there. Hydroponics, Has to do with nutrients dissolved in liquids and without soil. Instead, you have rocks or a variety of other things. Or you can kill it, and that is spray Roundup on it, which is, again, the only herbicide that's safe to use in a vegetable garden, and then wear it out. Those little tubers are difficult to wear out. It will take some perseverance. Each little tuber, if it's a mature tuber, will grow back maybe 11 or 12 times. And that means every 2 weeks, you have to go out there and yank off all the tops. And you won't get the bottoms, as I said earlier, when you do that. So kill it with Roundup and then wear it out. You're talking a minimum of 3 to 4 years. Or you can live with it. Did I forget to mention utilities? Did you forget to think about utilities? You're going to dig with your shovel, and what's underneath you? Tree roots are a problem, sure. But what about the telephone line that's buried coming into your house? Have you ever cut that with a shovel? I have. How about the fresh water line? And where water comes in, water goes out. How about your sprinkler tubings, your pipes for your sprinkler system? You want to cut one of those? Well, it can be prepared fairly easily. Sewer lines and sewer drainage lines are a little different. Some places have underground electrical coming into their house. I think they're designed not to shock you, but it would still be kind of a bad morning if you did that. So remember utilities. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit of composting. I don't have time to talk about hot composting, so we'll talk not too long about cold composting. We'll talk about some definitions, why compost, cold composting, and then methods of composting. What is compost? Compost is basically organic material in the process of decaying. It's a little further along, though, than, or it is further along than the raw organic material. But it's black and crumbly, and it has a lot of residuals of living things. Compost is a verb also, to make compost. This is the earlier slide on sandy soils, and if you want to add organic matter, compost directly increases the amount of organic matter. In other words, it's very efficient compared to uncomposted materials. Another definition, composting. There actually are two processes that we would call composting. The first happens in nature. The leaf falls from the tree, goes down on the bottom of the forest floor, and gradually over a fairly long period of time, 6 months or whatever, breaks down. A little bit of CO2 is given off in that process, but it doesn't heat up. On the other hand, what we do with the same little critters and creatures that break down the organic matter using the same of nature's tools is an attempt to reclaim the material that we're composting. And we can do it either a slow and cold, very much like what nature does, or we can try to make it go faster and hot and fast. Fast, a month. Cold, 6 months to a year. Hot enough to be unpleasant when you jam your hands in. If you're a thermometer buff, 140, 160 degrees. But we want to reclaim instead of lose the organic matter. These are nature's tools. And you're liable to see these in your gardens or in your compost. Most everything that you'll see out there under the leaves in the forest are part of our critters and agents that break down organic matter. So you, for example, would have eggshells and leaves, and then you have a whole chain of organisms to break it down. Eventually, everything seems to kind of eat everything else. But you'll see these things normally in your garden. Another definition, aerobic. that leaf that falls on the floor there breaks down using oxygen or air. If it falls into a pond or a swamp and goes underwater, there's not enough oxygen, and in that event it's called anaerobic. And that's the usual type of composting that happens in a swamp or in a landfill. And if you've ever walked over a landfill or smelled swamp gas, you're smelling methane, which is one of the products that's produced in anaerobic composting. You can also compost in a garbage bag. Anaerobic bacteria smell. You've smelled it before behind a garbage truck and probably inside your garbage cans. When you compost, it shouldn't smell bad. A couple of more definitions. Batch means a whole bunch at one time. In hot composting, you need a batch of materials to start, whereas with cold composting, you just add a little bit now, a little bit then, gradual additions. So why compost? One is to recycle. We talked about that earlier. Another is to improve the soil, and that's what we're really interested in. With compost, the soil retains its moisture and nutrients, unlike the sandy soil. The structure and the porosity are improved. Instead of just sand, you have little aggregates of organic matter with air in between them. Plant roots like that. You have greater resistance to erosion. Our sandy soils, either with or without the shells, can have a very alkaline nature. It's as if you threw lime on them. We don't do that down here unless we have a definite test to determine how acid or basic it is, called pH, a pH test. Those are also done here at Extension. But you don't just add lime like you might up north where the soils are more acid and would be better, more appropriate up north. But compost brings whatever the problem is of alkalinity, like you had used lime, or acidity, back towards neutral. And the plants like it better, more towards neutral. And it keeps it there. Obviously the plants are going to be happier and grow better, and they'll be healthier. That will help suppress plant disease. You can also make compost teas and pour them on the leaves, another whole topic. So what do you compost? And now we'll go to, instead of specific for the garden, in general, cold composting. Well, kitchen scraps, things that are lush and green and soft, garden waste, grass clippings. Don't want to let them all get matted up because you'll have a slimy mess. Citrus, sure. Manures are very good for gardens. In fact, speaking for myself, if you have fresh manure, I'd rather put that in earlier in the summer so it has a longer time to break down. The organic standards, I believe that you wait 4 months from the fresh manure until you harvest. So I would prefer in this event to use sterile manures, sterile compost that you can buy cheaply at various outlets around here. If you compost weeds, you'll get weed seeds. Sure, Florida has its weeds, but you're adding to it if you compost the seed pods. Eggshells have very little of anything in them other than calcium and a tiny bit of nitrogen, but they're part of the kitchen materials that you haul out. Dry, tough stuff, the brown materials, you would guess would be leaves, certainly wood, sawdust, wood chips, straw, paper. Paper is a little bit like the green grass clippings. If you have a whole bunch of them in a pile or in your garden, they'll make paper mache. So be aware of that. You want to avoid composting meat, fat, or grease. Draws flies, vermin, slows down composting. If you want to put herbicides and pesticides in your compost, you'll get herbicides and pesticides out. And more importantly, the pesticides will kill all the little nature's tools, or a lot of them, the insects particularly, that help break stuff down to our advantage. and the herbicides will come out untreated. You'll see that in your garden, and your garden won't grow. Pressure treated wood also has copper in it now. It used to have arsenic. The copper is also intended to stop the bacteria, etc., and probably not a lot of leaching, but for me that's a concern. If you put paper in your garden or in your compost, be aware. Some of the paper that you might put in there will be coated with material to keep it from breaking down. I did that years ago, and then I put the compost in my garden, and it's still there. The paper hadn't changed, and every time it rains, some of it floats away. If you put dog feces, I never know when my dog is sick, or cat feces. Cats carry a parasite called toxoplasmosis. Don't remember that. Just remember, cat feces doesn't belong in your garden or in your compost. If you have a cat, and if you let it outside, you need to do something to keep it out of your garden. Certainly, metal, plastic, glass, duct tape are not going to break down. Thorns and peach pits, if you're like me, sometimes you like to dig by hand, or you like to put your hand in compost if you're making compost. The thorns are hard to break down, and you'll end up with them in your hand. The peach pits have a little tiny point on one end, and they also are uncomfortable. If you have a health problem, you have an immune compromised situation, and those of you who have that probably know about it, you need to talk to your doctor to make sure that it's okay with him or her that you work in the soil outside and or make compost. And certainly normal hygiene, washing your hands after you compost or work in your garden, only makes common sense. The other thing you shouldn't compost, obviously, is nutgrass. And you laugh. Any kind of plant that has underground runners will also reappear magically in your garden if you compost it. So in general, if you want to go slow and cold in composting, what kind of volume do you have, and can you wait in order to have it? Clearly, if you started composting slow and cold now, it isn't going to be ready for your garden, generally. So it's going to take 6 months for the stuff to break down if you have a pile or a bin or whatever. Slow and cold, you can add any volumes of available materials. There's no chop, mix, and turn, and generally it's aerobic. The advantages, there's no chop, mix, and turn, as I said. Any combinations of green or brown materials can be used. It's really kind of made for gradual additions, and you need no thermometer or turning tools. The disadvantages, as I said, it's slow. There's reduced destruction of seeds and pathogens. Pathogens are things that make people or animals sick. And it also can become anaerobic with compaction or too much water, that sort of thing. Obviously, it can attract vermin and rats and maggots, etc. So, different composting methods. If you have so-so soil, you can put a whole lot of organic material on top of it. Trench or post hole composting implies dig a trench or put a post hole down into your garden here and put your material in that. Again, you can do composting for a garden in any kind of container, pit, pile, bin, pen, and what you're talking about is, depending on the definition, is highly variable. And you could buy a drum or a manufactured device, and that's composting. And you're probably at this point wondering how it relates to gardening in terms of what we need to do for the fall. So we're going to talk about soil preparation, about digging stuff in, adding mulch, and growing peas when you're done. Get lots, dig it in. What you want to do is add organic matter to your sandy soil. And what I would suggest is any two of the list. Compost if you have it, and I'm sure some of you have it, but a good many of you don't. Composted fines are available at times from the city of St. Petersburg, and it's as if you had composted material and sifted it. And if you were to call them, you might be able to find out where they'll be and when available. Canadian peat moss is expensive, but it does hold moisture and nutrients. Doesn't itself break down all that well over time, but it's a good way to provide some bulk organic material. Yard and garden waste, certainly. And if I were putting them into my garden in time for the fall, I would probably mow them up in my mower. That way, hoping that a plant with a root wouldn't hit a broad surface and maybe would be better going around it. But certainly you can put those things in your garden at this point. Again, I would use sterile manure or compost as opposed to fresh. There are a lot of people who would disagree with that. Your option. And most plant roots grow in the top 4 to 6 inches. Controversial area. The standard doctrine is 12 inches. Dig your material down 12 inches. You want to loosen up the soil down deep because you want good drainage if you don't have it. So dig down far enough to find out what's underneath your sand. Is it marl or a lot of shells and that sort of stuff? Is it clay, and how deep down is it? So you know about drainage. You want to put about 2 or 3 inches of organic material on top of the soil at some point and dig it in, okay? Since most of the plant roots go down only 4 or 6 inches, maybe you can dig down first and then later dig in a shallow fashion 4 to 6 inches your organic material. You're probably going to have less organic material this first time around than you'd like. So it'd be better to have a smaller garden well prepared than a long bed or whatever with limited organic material. Remember, as you dig material in, that all through the summer, organic material in the soil is disappearing. So you're kind of on a balance beam. You need to add more that's disappearing in addition to enough that will be there over time. And this is not a one-time shot. You're going to need to keep adding organic material all the time. You want to add mulch on top of that, 2 to 4 inches, something like that. Many advantages. To me, the most important are it suppresses weed germination, yay. It keeps the moisture down in the soil where you want it, rather than evaporating, and while it's there, it composts, all to our advantage. You want to use organic material to do that. I prefer organic over plastic or weed blocks or whatever. Certainly if you want to use those, you can, but I like the idea of organic material, particularly wood chips, wood shavings, straw. Some people like newspaper. And keep it moist. What you want is to compost on top of the soil, and the bacteria and the critters want it to be moist in order to break it down for you, in order for it to compost. And you can use a dilute liquid detergent, liquid soap, drench if you want to break the surface tension. That'll especially be true with wood shavings and leaves. Sometimes the water will hit them and not go down deeper. So composting methods would then include mulch composting and garden composting. You're composting in the garden. After you wait about 3 weeks, and I love doing this, you plant black-eyed peas. There are a lot of names for black-eyed peas, but you can get a bag of them in the grocery store fairly cheaply, more seeds than you can use. When they're about a foot or a little longer, a little higher tall, chop them down, dig them in. Black-eyed peas are legumes. That means they fix nitrogen. They take nitrogen out of the air. So you're getting free fertilizer because you're digging in the nitrogenous material into the soil. And it also adds organic material. The reason I like to do it is because I can look at the black-eyed pea plants and kind of get an idea where I am in terms of nutrients and that sort of thing. If they do poorly, then I'm a little concerned and begin to think about why. So here's where we've been. We talked about sand and nutgrass and, of course, utilities. A little bit about composting, trying to talk about composting in a way that would help understanding and encourage you to compost both in the garden and above, and about soil preparation. Would encourage you to plant the black-eyed peas. It's kind of fun to see something grow in your garden for the first time if you haven't. Vegetable gardening in Florida is certainly possible and doable. Would suggest you think about finding some reference information to use as you go along. This was designed to just get you started. Let the extension help you if you need it.
Thanks, John. Next, I will be talking about Pinellas County's growing conditions, soils, and fertilizers, with a special emphasis on what plants need to thrive. So we're going to talk about the growing conditions. And Pinellas County is kind of a unique place to garden. How many people are from someplace other than Florida? Most of us. I did grow up in Orlando, but then I lived outside of the state for about 35 years with my husband as he went around with his job. But my parents gardened, but I didn't care much for it then because I had to hoe. And hoeing to get the weeds out, that was not fun. That was not the fun part. So I was not fond of gardening when I was growing up, but I did come to where I enjoyed it a lot later on in my life. So some of the things that are issues here is our climate. Summer is hot, wet, and humid. And most vegetable plants don't like that. There are a few who will grow and thrive. But for the most part, they don't like our summers. Autumn, do we really have an autumn? Does it just...
2 weeks.
2 weeks, that's good. The winter is dry, mild, with an occasional frost or freeze. And that's a good time to grow here. The winter, the fall, winter, and spring. The spring is short, dry, and mild. So you'll notice there's a trend here. Winter, spring, dry. So that's going to be an issue that we have to deal with because most of our rain, normally we get about 50 inches of rain a year. The thing is, it all comes in the summer. And so we usually have very dry conditions the rest of the year. So what do plants need when they're growing? They need the right temperature, they need water, obviously, nutrients, and those nutrients can come directly from the soil or from soil amendments, things that we've put into the soil that John has been talking about, or fertilizer. All those things add nutrients. I'm going to say this just one time, this is my soapbox. Fertilizer is not plant food, regardless of what you see on all those bags. Plants make their own food through photosynthesis. But fertilizer provides very necessary nutrients. The soil amendments provide those nutrients that are necessary to make proteins and to make the enzymes that are necessary for plant growth. And they need air. What in the air do plants need? Oxygen. They also need CO2. Photosynthesis uses CO2 and water and sunlight to make sugar. But then when plants respire, when they break that glucose or sugar down to produce energy, then they use oxygen. So plants give off oxygen during photosynthesis and then they use some oxygen during respiration. So plants are the only source of oxygen in our atmosphere. So they're going to provide oxygen, but they're going to use a little bit too. Water is extremely important. We talked about those dry conditions in our best growing times. The winters are dry. April is usually our driest month, and we may have a great crop coming in April. So a source of water is going to be extremely important to grow a good vegetable garden. And then John talked about our sandy soils. They are very poor nutritionally, but they also have a poor water holding capacity. Once that sandy soil, which can during dry times become what's called hydrophobic, it repels water. John was talking, and I know you've seen where you put water on sandy soil and it just sort of beads up. It's because it's hydrophobic and the water doesn't seep in. Organic matter helps that. It helps the water to seep in, but even after it does seep in with from the hydrophobic conditions, it drains directly through the soil because there's not much to intercept and hold that water. And it's normally low in organic matter, and it's prone to leaching. Leaching means those nutrients that are in the soil, when the water comes through it, it takes those nutrients with it, and it may move them below the root zone of the plants that we're trying to grow. And in many cases, it can actually pollute our groundwater if there's a lot of excess nutrients that have been added to the soil. That's one of the reasons that here in Florida we recommend using as much as possible slow release fertilizers, because if you use a lot of water-soluble fertilizer, it leaches away. The roots may not have a chance to absorb it before it's gone. The soils in Pinellas County, we have several different kinds. Are there any of you that live up in the Oldsmar region, the northeast corner? I live up there. If you have the natural soil there, much of it is this mucky soil, which is a high organic soil to begin with. It doesn't always drain well. My house, however, has about 4 feet of filled dirt that was brought in. So the muck is about 4 feet underground for me. So my plants don't get any use from it. But if you're on the regular soil, you may have some organic matter already in your soil. The rest of the county, however, may be pine flatwoods or coastal soils that the coastal soils have some marl or shells mixed in. The pH of the soil is usually alkaline and maybe as high as 8, which is quite alkaline. The pine flatwoods can be fairly near normal in pH because it has been a forest situation in the past where a lot of pine needles have fallen. Those pine needles, as they decay, tend to acidify the soil. The muck we talked about, and it can have a pH sometimes of below 6 if you're on the actual muck soil. Most of the muck soil tends to be in a wetland or semi-wetland area, so if houses are built on it, many times there's been fill brought in to raise that level up above the water table so that you don't have flooding situations. The fill soil is awful. It's dredged from borrow pits. It's kind of a gray, has shells and stuff mixed in it, and it really has very low fertility because it was taken from a borrow pit. It may have been, I don't know, 10, 15 feet below the natural soil level. So there is very little fertility, and that type of soil needs to be built up with organic matter to have a successful garden. And the pH, we don't know what it is. That's something we have to have done, and we're going to talk about doing soil pHs. John has already mentioned this, that organic matter is that fraction of the soil that's composed of things that were once alive. Everything that was living decomposes, and in that forest situation where he was talking about compost happening, there might even be dead animals that are composting into that, and all kinds of stuff. So forest soils are very rich, and you don't see nutrient deficiencies in trees growing in the forest or other plants growing in the forest because they're getting those nutrients from that decaying matter that's on the floor of the forest. The substances that are secreted by plant roots and critters are also things that are in the soil. Plant roots have a symbiotic relationship with a fungal, a group of fungus that are called mycorrhizal fungi. And what these fungi do is that they create like a net around the roots of plants, and all plants in the world have specific mycorrhiza that are specific to them. And they help extend the roots system. They allow the roots to absorb nutrients better. And some of these substances secreted by the plant roots feed that mycorrhizal fungi, and then the mycorrhiza provide an easier access to some of the nutrients in the soil for the plants. And this is not something that you would normally see. This is microscopic. However, the mycorrhiza that is associated with pine trees is yellow, and it's growing in the soil. And sometimes if you have a pine tree, go out a ways, maybe, you know, if it's a large tree, go out about 10 or 15 feet. Dig down where the fine roots are. See if you can see that yellow mycorrhiza, because I bet you will. It's naturally occurring in nature. You can buy stuff that says it's mycorrhizal additives. When I was in graduate school, my graduate advisor and several of us graduate students did some research on mycorrhiza. And it doesn't really help to add it because it's already there. It's in the air. It blows around. But it's something that helps the plants as they grow. Humus is the final decomposition product of all that organic matter. Not hummus. Hummus is what you eat. That's H-U-M-M-U-S. But humus is that portion, once it's completely decayed, that's what the plants are using, is that humus. You saw this. John's picture was a little better than mine, but he had all these wonderful insects and critters that are in the process of decomposing any of the organic matter, either in your compost or in your soil. Both of those are important for this process. So don't be alarmed when you see these critters, because they're important. Almost all of the insect life that you see in the soil is beneficial. The bad insects are usually the ones you see on your plants, but there are a few that are in the soil that are not. We're going to talk about nematodes later, because that is a real problem in Florida. But there's some of those little earthworms. Not only do they help in the breaking down of organic matter, but they also aerate the soil as they're going through the soil. We talked about plants growing without fertilizers in nature. All of these other things are in there that are decomposing it and allowing those nutrients to be available to the plants. It slowly releases the nutrients. It dissolves minerals. Some of the things in the soil, like phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, may be mineralized in the soil and not available to the plant. Plants can't absorb minerals that are just in the soil. They have to be moved into the liquid portion or the water portion of the soil so that the plants can actually absorb it through their roots. And so fungi and some other things help dissolve those minerals, and that mycorrhiza is what's important for that. And organic matter does lower the pH somewhat of the soil and has some buffering, or buffering means that it keeps the soil pH from changing drastically over time. What do plant roots do in the soil? They respire, which means they are going through the process of breaking down glucose so that they can grow the energy they need to grow. They need oxygen to do that respiration, and they absorb nutrients. This root that comes out of a seed when it's first sprouting is called the radicle, and it is a true root. Have you ever rooted cuttings of things like plants in your garden or something? The roots that form on cuttings are not what are called true roots. They're called adventitious roots, and they are a little bit different in structure, but that's too much information. You don't need to know that. But this is a true root, the root that comes directly out of a seed, and they will start growing through the soil. The more loose and aerated that soil is, the better those roots can grow. So by preparing the soil and adding organic matter and digging it in and down, that prepares the soil for those roots to be able to grow really well. Vegetable plants grow fast. They require a lot of nutrients because they grow fast, and they require a lot of water. So if you've prepared the soil well, those roots can grow and absorb nutrients to fuel that fast growth. Preparing the soil is probably the most important thing that you're going to do for your garden. You want to know what type of soil you have, and you want to know the pH. We're going to talk about taking samples for a pH in just a moment. And then you want to amend the soil. That was what John was really covering, was how to amend your soil. The pH is the hydrogen ion concentration of the soil. And it has to do with whether it's acid. Many people call acid sour. Alkaline is sweet. Acid is a pH below 7. Alkaline is a pH above 7. 7 is neutral. For most plants, most vegetable plants especially, 6 to 8 is optimal for them. Actually, 8 is on the high side for vegetable plants. We do have a lot of landscape plants that will grow. About 7.2 is about the max for vegetable plants. So you want to look at what kind of soil you have. Is it pale and sandy, gray and moist, fill dirt, or is it dark and loamy already? Do you have good soil already? If you have been living in an area for quite some time, even if you just have had turf grass there, I bet your soil looks a little better underneath than just bare sandy soil. You might be surprised. So once you start to get ready for your garden and remove what's there already, check to see what kind of soil you have. Even if you have dark and loamy soil, you still need to add some soil amendments, some organic matter, to have the best garden possible. This is to give you some idea of why pH is important. These are important nutrients that plants need for growth. Some are minor nutrients, these are major nutrients. And you can see nitrates, which is nitrogen, is available at a wide range, and so is potassium. But look, aluminum is only available down here. It's not real, we don't have to worry about aluminum. But look at calcium. Calcium is not as available in this area, so you're going to need to maybe add a little bit of calcium. Phosphorus is readily available. Look at iron. It likes acid soil, and that's a very important nutrient. Magnesium's okay, sulfur. Manganese, we have problems with manganese deficiencies in Florida because we have much higher pH soils, and you can see that's a problem. Zinc can also be a problem. So adding micronutrients when you add fertilizer, and we'll talk about fertilizer in a little bit too, is going to be important because it's not always as available in our soils. Okay, when you get ready to do a pH test, here's what you need. You need a bucket, and you need a hand spade, just a trowel, some plastic baggies, and a marker to label those baggies, because you're going to go and determine the areas that you want to do a pH of. In this case, it's going to be your garden. And if you wanted to know the pH of your other areas, you could have a baggie for each of those areas. But you're going to look at your garden area and take maybe about 4 or 8 samples, depending on the size of that area. Dig down about 4 to 8 inches maybe, and put that scoop in your bucket from all of those different areas. Stir it all together, and then your baggie, take your trowel and put about a cup of it into the baggie, label it, bring it to our office here. We can do soil pH. You tell us you want to grow vegetables, we'll give you a recommendation based on what you want to do. You can send a more complete analysis off to the University of Florida and get calcium, phosphorus, potassium values, and I don't believe it gives you magnesium. I think it's just those 3. It may give you magnesium too. I can't remember, I'm sorry. But it does not give you nitrogen. Nitrogen is very mobile in the soil, and we don't check for that. That's why you need to be adding organic matter so you know there's sufficient nitrogen. It's easy to raise the pH by adding lime, but or dolomite. That, as John said, we don't normally need to do that in Pinellas County. There may be some soil up in that northeast corner of Pinellas County where you might need to add some lime, but for the most part we don't need to do it unless you're using raised beds, because the soil mix that you've put in there may end up being a little more acid than you need, or it may not have enough calcium. Dolomite adds calcium to the soil. Lime is calcium carbonate, and so it does add calcium to the soil. Acidifying the soil is a little bit harder. If you have a naturally alkaline pH, which many of us do, if it's around 7 to 7.5, you're probably okay. You can still grow vegetables by adding organic matter and letting that slowly acidify the soil. You can add a little elemental sulfur, and when we do a soil pH, we'll let you know if you need to add a little bit of that. But if you have a very high pH, close to 8, you may want to consider using raised beds or containers, because there's no practical way to really lower that pH so that your vegetables will grow well. If you feed the soil will nurture your plants. That's an important thing. So you want to pay really close attention to your soil. And I won't go into great detail because John has done a really good job of going over composting. Peat moss, you can add that to the soil. Manure, remember, if it's not already composted, you need a good lag time before when you add fresh manure, because it can contaminate your vegetables, but it can also burn your vegetables if you're adding fresh manure right to the soil. And fertilizers. The organic matter does improve, and probably the most important thing is that it improves the water holding capacity of the soil. And it conditions the structure, and John has already talked about these things too, but it supports those living soil organisms. Those things are important when they're in the soil. They are helping to break things down and make it available to your growing plants. And it also reduces the rate of nutrient release so that it will hold those nutrients and release them slowly back to your plant roots. So and it keeps them from leaching from the soil every time you have a high rain event. We talked about improving plant root growth, because the soil is much more, the word that a really technical word that they use is friable, because it's very crumbly and easy for the roots to move through. The other thing that compost does is there's been some research that shows that it suppresses plant diseases. There are a lot of fungal diseases and bacterial diseases in the soil that can attack your vegetable plants, and compost can actually suppress those diseases, and there are even beneficial nematodes in compost that will attack the bad nematodes, the root knot nematodes or sting nematodes. So they can also be a moderating force in nematode control too. So organic matter is good stuff. You need to definitely be doing that. The nutrients that are available to your plant, and I've mentioned this already, water solubility in a fertilizer determines its usefulness. So once it is dissolved in the soil water, it becomes available to the plants. But if it's all dissolved at one time, the likelihood of your plants being able to take it all up are very slim. So the slow release kind is much better, because this 100% water soluble stuff can leach from the soil. Even when you're irrigating your garden, the water soluble fertilizer is moving below the root zone of your vegetable plants. So slow release is better. And manures and composts are the best. Natural minerals, coated fertilizers. When you're buying a fertilizer, it will either say, it may say slow release, it may say polycoated, it may say water insoluble nitrogen. All of those things means that it's more than likely slow release, and that will be timed release. It'll say, that word I don't like, feeds for 3 months, feeds for 6 months. that tells you that it's a slow release fertilizer. Most of the organic fertilizers, and you see many more of those in the stores these days. Used to be you never saw organic fertilizer in the stores, but you do see them now in the stores, and they have a lower nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium content usually, but they are always slow release because it takes some bacterial or fungal activity on the part of what's in your soil to release those nutrients. Why do we want to apply fertilizer in the first place? To establish new installed plants, because we want the desired result. The desired result is a good crop from our vegetables, right? We don't want these plants to just grow and not feed us, because we're trying to, that's the whole purpose of us growing them. We want to promote the growth of the plants, enhance that vegetable production, and prevent any or correct nutrient deficiencies. If you prepare your soil properly, you're not going to have those nutrient deficiencies. You're going to have addressed that before you ever plant your vegetables. But you will need to add a little bit of fertilizer while your garden is growing. John talked about the benefits of mulch, and this one, this particular picture, I believe is pine needles that they have mulching this garden. But anytime you can put mulch around your garden plants, you're going to suppress weeds. It will help moderate the soil temperature. It keeps your plants clean. And there are things like that have fruit that lay on the ground, like squash or cucumbers if you don't grow them on a trellis, or if you're trying to grow strawberries. Having a mulch under them will keep fungus from rotting that fruit as it's ripening too. It adds nutrients and organic matter to the soil, and it helps control erosion. Lots of different kinds of mulch. You can use bark, newspaper, straw, leaves. But what about plastic and landscape fabric? You can make your rows and put a plastic mulch and then make holes and plant your plants in them. This is something that a lot of the commercial farmers do in Florida. Research has been shown that red mulch really is good for tomatoes, because not only does it help hold the moisture in the soil and that sort of thing, but it tends to from the research they've shown, it has a better crop, more fruit, the fruit ripens quicker. You can use newspapers too. Don't have to shred them. If you want to just put them down in the aisles that you have, you can put them down. You may cover them with other mulch. They're going to decay. You can put them between your plants if you have nicely little spaced plants. Anything is fine to do that. When I get to the gardening one in our next segment, I'm going to go over the different kinds of fertilizers. This was just going to be an overview. We've been talking about preparing the soil for your garden. Now we'll look at choosing the site and then designing your garden plot. Not everyone has a lot of space for a garden, so I will also touch on ways to maximize space. Then I will also cover the common pest, insect, and disease problems that you might encounter. We're going to talk now about the nitty-gritty, down to the vegetables. And you may find that there's some repetition in this also, but you know, they say, educators say, things you need to know it 3 times. You need to hear it 3 times before it becomes learned. So there may still be some repetition here, but that's on purpose. So today we're going to learn where to put your garden, how to prepare the soil, which we've talked about extensively, what vegetables you might want to grow, how to plant seeds, and how to start and starter plants, and how to care for them, what insects are a problem, because that could be probably our biggest issue, and what to do during the summer. And John has touched on that briefly, but I've got some other things to talk to you about. Okay, here's probably some of the first considerations you have. Where your garden's going to be, you've got to select the site, and what kind of garden is it going to be? Is it going to be a raised bed? Is it going to be in the soil? Is it going to be in containers? Which vegetables do you like? You don't want to grow things you're not going to eat, or then you're just going to feed your neighbors. And then what are you going to do if you've got a surplus? Look at this, you know. Do you have the right tools? Do you have the time? Because it's not something that you just plant the garden and leave it. And what will it cost? So when you get ready to find the right spot, it needs to be near your house. You're more likely to take care of it if it's near your house. But there are community gardens, and we're finding that there are more of those in Pinellas County springing up. But if that community garden is not too far from where you live, you will be more likely to take care of it if you're renting a spot in a community garden. You want good soil, and you may have to create that soil. We've talked about that. You may have to be the creator of that good soil. An irrigation source. Water is probably the most important thing. It's a limiting factor. No water, no garden, because it's so important. A sunny spot, 5 to 6 hours a day of full sun is considered a sunny spot. I've had a couple of questions about gardening in containers inside your pool enclosure. The screen or a screen porch, the screen does provide shade, about 20% shade. So you need to make this sunny time longer. I do container gardening on my pool enclosure, and I try to make sure that my vegetables get 8 hours of sun a day. So I pick the very sunniest spot. And you need to watch that spot, because in the winter, when we're growing in the fall, winter, and spring, the sun is lower in the southern sky. Right now it's overhead. So the sun that you have now may not be what you're going to have when you have your vegetable garden. You need to be looking at that. You need to look to see if you've got any large trees to the southwest or southeast that may be shading the area once the winter sun is in the southern sky, is down in the southern sky. You definitely want to avoid tree roots. And trees send roots out a long way. You may not even have a tree, but your neighbor might. And tree roots usually go out 3 times at least as that tree is tall. So if you've got a 20-foot tree, those roots are going out 60 feet or more. And so that can be an issue. And those little fine roots that are way out there are the ones that are absorbing nutrients and water. So if your garden is in the same spot, those tree roots may be more efficient than your vegetables at intercepting that water and intercepting those nutrients that you're putting on your garden. So if you've got tree roots, when you start digging, if you notice you've got lots of roots, once you amend that soil and make it very friable and add it so it'll hold water and add lots of organic matter, that tree is going to say, oh, yum, and it's going to move more roots into that area. So you need to be careful with tree roots. You may, if you have them, you may want to consider a raised bed. Also consider the fact that if those roots know that there's that raised bed there, they'll move up there. They'll fill that up too, so you're going to need to have a liner that keeps those roots away. And if you have a liner, you will need to put drain, especially if it's a plastic liner, you're going to need a way for water to drain from your raised beds, and you'll need to drill those holes along the side at the base so that excess water can move out, and that you don't have a pond eventually if you have a lot of rain. So those are things to consider if you've got tree roots. Also, if you have septic lines, if you don't want to put your garden over your septic drains field if you have a septic tank, because those roots will find that septic drain field, and they may be absorbing things that you don't want in your vegetables. So you don't want to have it near the septic lines. Plus, those roots can interfere with the drainage of your septic system too. So don't want to do that. You need to consider whether you need a fence. Do you have rabbits in your neighborhood? Rabbits love vegetables. So you need to think about those things. You need to think of what might be impacting your vegetables. So you're going to get ready to prepare your garden spot. And you'll notice, this is interesting, and my dad always did this too. Because you want your garden to have good drainage, if you are gardening in your garden soil, you might consider making the bed areas a little bit higher than the tracks that you're going to be walking in, so that this soil is nice and loose, but also so that it drains well. This is really good if you're growing things like squash and cucumbers and that sort of thing. They like to be grown up on a hill for some reason. You want to clear the ground first, and if you have grass growing where your garden is going to be, you don't need to, especially if you've got St. Augustine or something like that, you don't need to dig it up because you're taking away some of the topsoil if you do that. But you probably want to spray it with Roundup, let it die, and then you can dig it into the garden area because it will decay. I want to say a brief little bit about Roundup. The patent for glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, is expired. So now there's lots of companies making products that have glyphosate in them. So Roundup figured they needed to do something to make their product different. And you need to be really careful about that because they all say Roundup, but they have things in them like diquat, additional ingredients, diquat, 2,4-D, some other things, the dicamba. Those are things you don't want in your vegetable garden. You don't want to buy the Roundup products that have these additional ingredients in them because that's not something that is appropriate for a vegetable garden. So be sure that it has the active ingredient just says glyphosate, or buy one of the knockoffs because they're what Roundup used to be. And they're cheaper. So you want to clear the ground, till or spade the soil to a depth of 12 inches. And John told you that that helps you incorporate stuff, but the growing area is only going to be about the top 6 inches of soil, but you break it up so that it drains well. This will also tell you whether you have a hard pan down there. And that's an area of soil that is extremely dense. Sometimes it's because, especially if you're creating your garden in an area that was turf grass, if you've had a company that's been mowing your grass with one of those big lawn equipment type things, it compacts that lower soil and creates this hard pan that water doesn't go through. And this can be an issue for drainage in your garden. And you may want to my dad, I know, had one place, he had 3 gardens, but one place that had hard pan, and he took a metal rod and a sledgehammer and just knocked holes in the hard pan, broke it up so that the water would percolate properly. You want to apply your amendments and then collect for the soil test. We talked about how to do that collection. If you're going to build a raised bed, decide how high you want to build it. 10 to 12 inches, we'll talk about that in a minute, or 6 inches at least. Fill with potting soil or soil from the ground. You can use either one, but if you're trying to avoid nutgrass or other weeds, you may not want to use soil from the ground. You may want to use a soil that you purchase from a lawn or a garden center. And it could be either potting soil, or you can purchase topsoil from those places too. You'll add the amendments, you'll collect for the soil pH if necessary, and I think it's always necessary. You need to know what the pH of your soil is. That way you have one more piece of information to help you be successful. That's an important piece of information that you need when you're doing vegetable gardening. And we've talked about all the different kinds of organic matter that you can add: compost, rotted leaves, grass clippings, horse manure or cow manure. At this point, if you're going to plant this fall, though, it needs to be already composted or rotted cow manure, or purchase what you can buy in a lawn care center like Black Cow, or you can have, there's one that's called Black Hen too, I believe, that's chicken manure that's been composted. Those are fine. Fine mulch. As John said, sometimes it's available from St. Pete. The county no longer has it. They did for a while, but they do not provide it any longer. And you can add a balanced fertilizer right at planting time. And on this one, we do have a little bit higher numbers here for phosphorus. And if you're adding a slow-release fertilizer just to your vegetable gardening bed, that higher fertilizer up to about 6 or even 8 is not going to be a problem, because vegetables use a lot of phosphorus. So they're going to be using that up during the growing process. 3 or more weeks prior to your planting. So this is, need to start doing it now, because by September you want to be ready, right? Ready, at least by the middle of September. Check your pH, dig those amendments into your soil. We've talked about lime. You're probably not going to need to add lime unless you're up there in that one corner of Pinellas County. But base it on the soil test. If you tell us you're going to grow vegetables, we'll tell you what to put on your garden as far as either lime or sulfur or nothing. You may be perfect already. You can use just about any kind of container for container gardening. You can use even old styrofoam ice chest. You can use big cans even to grow things in. As long as you've got some drainage holes in the bottom, buckets, baskets, plastic bags. And when we say plastic bags, now you laugh, somebody's laughing about plastic bags. Usually it's like you buy a bag of compost or potting soil and then you just cut X's in it and plant your plants directly in it. Works. It's amazing. Barrels and drums. I went to a you-pick blueberry farm over in Hillsborough County in the spring, and every blueberry plant was in one of these blue drums cut in half. So they had half drums all the way along, and the blueberry plants were growing one plant to each drum. It was just acres and acres of drums. But the guy said that they grow best that way. And this is a strawberry pot. Are you familiar with those that have the little holes in the sides? They don't. You're absolutely right. Someone said they never work, and it's because you have to put something in the middle to get the water to the whole pot. And usually, and what I have found is very helpful is you put a paper towel tube down in there and fill that with small stones. Then pull the paper towel tube out. Then you've got that straight, not quite clear to the bottom, but that allows water to get in the whole pot when you water it. That works really well. Some of the different kinds of raised beds, someone asked about using pressure-treated lumber for the sides of your raised beds. When we had copper arsenate as a treatment, they did find that the arsenic leached into the soil. You can no longer buy that kind of treated lumber, but if you're using old treated lumber, it might be that. You can't buy it that way anymore. But I have some, I'm kind of like John, I have some questions about even the newer pressure-treated lumber that just uses copper to treat it with. You can use cinder blocks. You could use pine, cedar, redwood, the plastic manufactured wood. All of those things work well. And as John said, 4 feet wide is about as wide as you want to make it, because that's how far you can reach toward the middle. And any length that you want, I think he said 4 feet or by 8 feet. This one says 5 to 8. 6 to 12 inches high. Or if you have someone in a wheelchair or that wants to garden, make it about 24 inches or a little bit higher and fill it with soil. You don't have to fill the whole 24 inches with soil though, because that would be kind of a waste. You can put a bottom in about 12 inches deep, fill that part with the soil, and then you're just putting your bed up high enough for someone in a wheelchair or that does not want to bend over far to use. So you don't want to fill that whole thing with soil, because then it would be kind of a waste. There's lots of other containers, and there was a question earlier about grow boxes or earth boxes, and we do have an earth box in the back. Those work fine. You just need to be sure that the container is large enough to provide the soil mass that's necessary for the plant. Things like tomatoes and peppers need, probably 12 to 14 inches around at least, and maybe about 12 inches deep. Remember though that things in containers are going to need water much more often, because depending on how dry it's been and what the temperature is, you may have to water it every single day. You might have to water it twice a day if you're planting in September, because we're still kind of hot if we don't have rain on a regular basis. If you're using big black containers like this, the sides may get hot, and that helps dry out the soil too. So you need to careful that they don't wilt. You don't want to go out every day and see your plants wilted. That stresses them. They don't have the energy to put toward blooming and producing fruit or produce for you. So you don't want to see that wilting. You want to anticipate the fact that those plants need additional water. Here's one of some tomato plants in a plastic bag. It's probably a bag of either compost or topsoil. Here's a pot that has a lot of different things growing in it, some herbs, and that looks like mustard and maybe some lemongrass. So you can even make them quite attractive if you want to plant them in your front garden. The other thing you can do is you can have an edible landscape. There are beautiful lettuces, some that are red and burgundy. You could plant those along your flower bed, or along the edge of your flower bed. Be creative. You never know what you might be able to grow in some space that you thought was not really space for gardening. Someone asked earlier about soilless media, and this is a sample mixture. This is one of many, many recipes out there. There are lots on the internet, and this is one though that tends to do well in Florida, and that's using builder sand, some kind of organic matter. It could be compost that you've created or compost that you've purchased, peat, dolomite, and this is because this type of arrangement or mixture of stuff tends to be a little on the acid side. So the dolomite will bring that pH up to where you need it, and it tells you how much to use. And then 1 cup of balanced fertilizer with micronutrients. And you need to look on the back of the fertilizer bag. You need to look to see if it has those micronutrients in it, because some fertilizers are just 888, just nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And those other nutrients are extremely important, especially in a mixture like this that doesn't have any native soil in it. Organic gardening is also growing in popularity. Organic gardening uses no synthetic chemicals, meaning pesticides and fertilizer. These are fertilizers that are produced from chemicals. Chemical fertilizers are chemical pesticides. There are organic ways to combat pests, and also organic fertilizers that you can use. And one of those organic fertilizers obviously is compost. But you can purchase organic fertilizers also. This is, you build your soil. That's the most important thing, because remember that slide a while back that says if you feed the soil, it will nurture your plants. And that's really true. It's environmentally safe, and it's nature's way of doing things. And the ways you're using for organic gardening, you're using compost. Compost is important for organic gardening, probably the most important thing that you're going to do, because it's that part of that soil building process. Mulch is important because it keeps down weeds. You don't have to worry so much about weeds. And it adds more organic matter back to the soil because you're going to be using an organic mulch. Animal manures, animals that are herbivores, that only eat plant materials, are the types of manures that you want to use. Horses, cows, goats, rabbits. Is that all? Maybe close anyway. Someone asked about rabbits. You can use the manure from rabbits directly on your plants. You don't even have to compost it. Green manures. Green manures are plants that you turn under. And John touched on that with the black-eyed peas. You don't let them grow to their full maturity and produce the peas, because that's using a lot of the nitrogen that they've fixed in the soil, because legumes do fix nitrogen in their roots. You're letting them grow partway, and then you're tilling them into the soil and letting them decay and add that nitrogen back to the soil. You'll be doing some crop rotation, and we're going to talk about that as a way of, in all of your gardening, to keep down pest buildup. But it's very important in organic gardening. Planting like families of plants together and moving where they are in the garden on a rotational basis, so that if it's a pest that affects that particular family of plants, they don't have a chance to build up because you've moved them somewhere else the next time you plant them. And that does help with pest buildup. There are some home remedies out there for treating pests. Natural predators. You want to encourage those beneficial insects, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute too. And planting resistant varieties. There are varieties of plants that are resistant to maybe to nematodes and to some of the fungal diseases that we have. When you're getting ready to design your garden, and I'm going to challenge you to do that up front, to decide what you want to do, and use the Florida gardening guide that we gave you, the Florida vegetable gardening guide, because in the back it'll tell you some of the varieties that are good for Florida. And I like that because it'll tell you the different ones and the ones that are the varieties that are actually good for Florida. You'll want to look for some of those because those are ones that have been shown to be very successful in our environment. Draw your plan on paper. Decide if you're going to have a 4x4, what are you going to plant where? And you need to look at your sun pattern and know how the sun is going to be, because it's going to be lower in the sky, and you're going to have to figure out what's going to shade what. And there's some controversy about whether you want your rows going north and south or east and west, because it depends. Because if you have some really tall plants, you want them on the north, because they will conceivably shade your other plants with that low sun. So you want the shortest things the furthest south and the tallest things in the north. If you're going to use a trellis, put things on a trellis in the north side. And maximize your space. And we're going to talk about how to maximize your space, because you might be surprised at what you can grow in a little bit of space. So you want to group them by family, as I was saying, because that helps with crop rotation. And you want to look at when plants are going to mature, because you might be able to plant two things that mature at different times close together. You might be able to plant early things with later things and actually use the plant. And that's called interplanting, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Plant by size. The tall plants to the farthest away from the sun, and the shorter plants closer to the south. Similar spacing. And that's something you need to pay some attention to, because some things you can grow fairly thick, like lettuces and those kind of things, if you're going to pick them when they're small, or if you're going to pick your carrots when they're baby carrots, or radishes when they're tiny. But if you're not, you need to pay attention to what it says on the package about how far apart to put them. Like broccoli plants, you buy them, and if you've got transplants, they may be about 4 to 6 inches tall, and they look small. But a broccoli plant is going to get to be this tall and about this wide. So you've got to give it room to grow so that it's not stunted because it's too close to its neighbors. You can plant so that you shade the whole soil, but you need to pay attention to some of those planting spacing recommendations. You can plant herbs in your garden too, and you might want, since many of our herbs are perennials, except for the basils, a lot of our other herbs are perennials, you might want to plant those with some of our longer season crops, things that take longer to mature. That's another good thing about the gardening guide. It tells you how long it is from the time you plant it till when you can expect the harvest, which is a good thing, because you may be thinking, well, when did I plant that? Keep a record. Keep a journal. Think about that. I try to do that. I'm not real good about it. When I had a real garden, I did it quite regularly. But if you do that, then you're not surprised by the fact, well, is it taking too long? I have to go back for a minute, because one of the questions, and maybe this question will be asked, but someone was asking me about growing things in containers in a pool enclosure, and about squash and cucumbers. And squash and cucumbers need bees for pollination. So if you grow those in your pool enclosure, you have to become the bee. And you need a little painter's brush, a little artist's brush, and you go to the male flowers and collect pollen, and you pollinate the female flowers. That's how you get fruit inside a screened enclosure. So that's something that you have to consider. And I have done that, and it works fine, but it is a little labor intensive. But you do get squash and you do get cucumbers. Some of the ways to maximize space: growing things on a trellis. You put it on the north side because it could be screening or shading your plants. And some of the best things to grow on a trellis are peas and beans. Matter of fact, they do the best unless you're planting bush beans. Some green beans are bush beans, and they grow in nice little mounding bushes, and you don't need to put that on a trellis. But if you're growing pole beans or runner beans, they need to be supported. And peas always vine. Cucumbers do well. That way you don't have the fruit or the vegetables, the cucumbers lying on the ground. Keeps them from getting mold on them on the bottom side. So that's a good thing. And you can do squash that way too. It's a little more intensive because you have to tie them up somewhat. Cucumbers, beans, and peas will all twine up the trellis themselves. Wide rows are another way to maximize space. Instead of having a row with just one plant going down the row, one right after another, consider a wide row. You can grow a whole lot more plants in a smaller space. And the way to do that is once you determine how wide, you may want your wide row to be about 12 to 18 inches wide. And once you've prepared your soil, then rake it in one direction. Then do the seeding of it. Spread your seeds evenly over that raked area. Then rake it in a perpendicular manner to cover the seeds with soil. And then water it until the seeds come up. And once you have the seedlings growing, you're going to need to thin them because you're probably going to have too many for them to mature well. So, and actually one of the things you can do is take some of the seedlings that you take out and create another wide row. Plant them in another row, or plant half of it as a wide row and leave the other half to take your seedlings. And a couple of things that does, it maximizes the use of your seeds, but it also extends your harvest, because these are growing a little faster and will probably mature faster than these that you have pulled out that were growing in between. So you may have a little bit longer harvest season that way. Corn. You need a lot of space to grow corn. And it should be planted in blocks, because corn, the way corn is pollinated, you have tassels on the top, and then you have all the corn silks that are coming out of the ear of corn. The pollen has to reach those corn silks. Every corn silk that's there needs to have a grain of pollen to produce one of the kernels of corn in the ear. And if you plant them in squares that are fairly dense, then you have the opportunity for that pollen to fall on all of those corn silks. If you have a very sparse row planted in a long row, you're not as likely to get a good crop of corn, or you will have ears of corn that are not full. There will be a lot of little spaces between your kernels because they weren't all pollinated. So it requires a large amount of fertilizer, but it needs about 1 square foot per corn plant. And that's a lot of space in your garden. So you need to determine, if you only have a small amount of space, whether corn is really something that you want to grow. Interplanting, we talked a little bit about that, and you can take short and long season vegetables. Here we've got carrots and radishes. The radishes will grow fairly quickly. You get to harvest your radishes pretty fast, and it takes about almost the whole season to grow carrots. So you can plant them both together, and you'll have harvested the radishes before the carrots are starting to get very large, and then you allow the carrots to mature. So you've used that space twice in the season. You can do that with corn, using lettuce to grow under the corn. And we talked a little bit about shading the lettuce, that allowing some shade for the lettuce extends its growing season. When it gets hot, lettuce bolts. That means that it sends up this bloom stalk straight up, and then the leaves become very bitter. So you want the lettuce to stay nice and compact so that the leaves are still tasty. Once it starts to bolt, it's usually not very tasty. So this allows for some shade on your lettuce while it's growing, especially as it gets hotter. You can use beans to grow on your corn. The Indians did this way back when. They grew corn and beans together. They usually grew squash too, that grew around underneath the corn. They called it the three sisters: squash, corn, and beans. But the beans will grow up the corn as the corn grows, and then you don't have to provide a separate trellis. This is if you have a lot of space to grow the corn. Succession planting will extend your harvest. you can plant, in this case they're showing corn planted, and it's probably a couple of weeks in between the plantings, so that once this corn is mature and gone and harvested, then this corn comes up and is, but you can do that with a lot of things. You can do that with carrots, with lettuce, with one of my favorite vegetables is not one that you see very often in the grocery stores. It's called kohlrabi. Companion plantings. Have you ever heard about planting one thing with another and it'll keep the insects away, or it'll keep certain things away, or they benefit each other? There's been a lot of research that shows that that may not be the case, but there is some research that shows some of the things are really good. Compatibility issues, sometimes it doesn't matter what you plant with each other. Onions and garlic don't protect other vegetables from pests. If you grind up the garlic tops and spray them on the other things, you can kind of keep pests away, but just growing the garlic doesn't necessarily do that. One thing used to say that marigolds kept the nematodes away from your other plants in your garden, and it doesn't do that. Marigolds are resistant to nematodes, and there's research that shows that they actually kill the nematodes with their roots because they're toxic to the nematodes, but they don't necessarily protect your other plants unless you plant them as a cover crop in the summer to reduce the nematode population in that soil. And we'll talk about more things to do in the summer in a minute, but that's an option. But they're not going to necessarily protect your plants while you're just growing them beside them. Nitrogen fixation, though, is a real thing. Legumes fix nitrogen in their roots. They have these little nodules, and you may pull up bean plants and think that they have root knot nematodes because you see these little raised nodules along the roots, but that's not the case. That's where they're fixing nitrogen from the air or from the soil. And they only benefit themselves while they're growing because they're fixing the nitrogen and they're using it. But if you use them as a cover crop, or if you plow them back under, then they decay and add that nitrogen that they fixed and not used back to the soil. When planting seeds in your garden, there are a couple of things to remember. And you can buy transplants of a lot of the most common things, but a lot of things do best if they're grown by seed. And lettuce and things like that, plant them by seed. It's much better than paying for a transplant. You can get a lot more lettuce from one small container of seed. But lettuce seed is really small. And if you mix it with builder sand 1-to-1, you won't plant it too thickly. The other thing to remember about lettuce is it needs light to germinate. So you don't want to bury it in the soil. Just sow the seeds on top of the soil and kind of pat them in, because they need that light to be able to germinate. And that's really the only thing that it's the only one of our vegetables that requires light. Or if you're going to bury them, make a slight dent in the soil, sprinkle the seeds, dust soil on top. If it's large like a bean, you want to plant it about as deep as the soil, the seed is big. Lima beans are pretty large. Some of the other beans, like bush beans or runner beans, are pretty good sized seed too, so you want to plant those a little deeper. The back of the seed package tells you how deep to plant the seeds, and that you need to follow that. Some of the things that you plant as seeds, you may want to plant them in little grow boxes first, little seeding trays, and grow them up first and then transplant them to your garden. You could do that with tomatoes or peppers, lettuce. I prefer lettuce in the soil, eggplant, cucumbers. Strawberries, actually, you don't grow from seed. If you order strawberry plants or buy them, you get little bare root plants about this big, and then you plant those. And you might want to plant those in small pots first to get them, grow them up and know which ones are going to survive. That's the best thing about doing this. If you plant seeds in the soil, you are not certain how many of those are going to come up and thrive. If you plant them in little starter containers, you can pick the best ones to plant out into your garden. You will need to protect them from heavy rain because you could wash all the soil out of there while they're growing. So you'll need to give them a little bit of protection. They don't need a lot of direct sunlight until they come up above the soil. Then they're going to need sunlight. They need to be moved into the sunlight because that'll be important for them to grow well. Otherwise, they get very spindly. If you've got seedlings in little grow pots or little seedling pots, you want to gently remove it and try not to disturb the root ball. And depending on the size of that transplant, it could be a very small root ball or it could be a little larger. And then you want to dig a hole a little bit larger than the root ball and plant it at about the same depth that it was in its container. This little broccoli or cabbage plant, I can't tell which it is planted too deeply. It's way below its crown, is below the ground. Fill in with the soil and a little bit of water as you go so that the soil settles well around the roots. Some things, though, you can plant deeper. Tomatoes benefit from actually having all but the top couple of leaves planted in the ground. And you can plant the root and kind of hold it sideways and let it come up because it produces new roots all along that stem that's underground. And peppers will do that too to some extent, but tomatoes especially do well. And many times if you're buying transplants of tomatoes, they're kind of tall to begin with and there's not many leaves on that bottom part. Bury all of that and it will produce new roots. It will hold the plant better as it grows. Some things too you need to remember about staking or putting a cage around, and tomatoes are one. Peppers sometimes need to be done that way. Eggplant. Things that have heavy fruit need to be supported so that they don't break the vines or fall over. And we could talk a little bit about water. Water is extremely important. If you have planted seeds in your garden, you need to water every single day until you see green leaves from those seeds. Because once seeds start imbibing water to germinate, if that water is not there on a routine level basis, they will die and it won't germinate well. So that's extremely important. After they sprout, you can water every other day until they start getting a little bigger. And you can get to the point where you may only have to water once a week, especially when it gets cooler and we have cooler nights. You can get by with maybe once a week. I really like the idea of drip or trickle irrigation in your garden. You don't have to go and buy one of these really elaborate systems. You can buy a drip hose. It's just a rubber hose that's very porous. And you can trickle that, just thread it through your garden and run it, and the water trickles out very slowly and will soak into the soil much more efficiently that way. But the thing to remember, seeds need constant moisture to germinate. This goes with the seeds in your soil or seeds in the little sprouting boxes too. All right, we're going to talk about pests. There are all kinds of pests. We'll talk about insects in a minute, but there's piercing, sucking insects and chewing insects and insects in the soil. And some of the other pests are birds and deer and raccoons and armadillos and rodents. They can all be very damaging, and some of them it's really difficult to control. Armadillos, you can put up a fence, but you need to bury that fence about 12 inches below the soil level all the way around too, because they can dig that far. And if they want to get in there, they will dig under it. Rabbits, it's easy to fence out. Just be sure when you close your fence at the end of the day that the rabbit's not on the inside. Some birds, especially, will come and eat your lettuce seeds that are on the top of the ground. So you may want to see whether you're feeding them or not. Some of our piercing and sucking insects, these are the common ones: whiteflies, aphids, leafhoppers. Stink bugs are bad insects. This one's one of mine, one that's really kind of cool. It's a leaf-footed bug. The backs of their back legs look like little leaves on them, but they pierce, especially the fruit like tomatoes and peppers. They can pierce that and start sucking out the juice. Thrips, one thrips, it's not a plural, it's one thrips or many thrips. And spider mites are also a problem. You can control these. You can start with insecticidal soap. I believe you really should try the least toxic method first. And you want to scout your garden periodically. You want to go out there about every other day. You're going to be watering anyway. look for pests. If you catch them early, it's much easier to control them. If you wait until you've got a huge population of pests, it's going to be extremely difficult. So insecticidal soap first. Neem oil is one of my favorites. This is an oil from a neem tree, and it's not only an insecticide, but it's also a fungicide. So it can be, and it's a miticide. So it's a kind of an all-purpose thing that is also organic. It can treat spider mites, it can treat any of these piercing, sucking things, and some of the fungal diseases that our plants have too. So it's a good thing to have in your arsenal. Fish oil, Organicide is one of the brand names of fish oil. This is not fish meal or that sort of thing, which is a fertilizer. This is fish oil, and believe me, it smells like fish, but it does a good job. Carbaryl is the active ingredient in 7, which is a chemical pesticide. Spinosad is one that's a little more organic. It's not labeled organic by OMRI, but it's a fermented product that is not a chemical pesticide. There's some of the inactive ingredients that don't suit ORMI, so it's not labeled for those people who want to sell things and label them as organic. But if you're gardening in your own garden and want to use less chemical pesticides, this is a good one to use. Chewing insects, beetles and weevils and caterpillars and pickleworms and corn earworms. There are just a lot of things out there that want to eat your plants. And caterpillars can be pretty easily controlled if you catch them early. The smaller they are, the easier they are to kill. And BT is a bacteria that makes the caterpillars sick. You spray it on your plants, the caterpillars are still feeding, but they get sick from eating it and they stop feeding and they die. So this is a biological control that's very safe for the environment. Spinosad also is safe for the environment. And again, Carbaryl is 7 dust. But if you have any kind of caterpillars, use the BT. That's really the best treatment for them. If you've got tomato hornworms that are big, pick them off. And if you don't like to touch them, wear some gloves and squash them or put them in a bucket of soapy water or something, because they're usually pretty large. And one large tomato hornworm can defoliate a tomato plant pretty quickly. They are ravenous eaters. So, and cabbage lopers can also consume your broccoli or cabbage plants or some of anything else in the brassica family. So you want to catch them very quickly, and you may have to look under the leaves to see them. If you start seeing little holes in something, look really closely, find out what's eating it, and figure out how to get rid of it, because they are going to be eating what you want. So the insects are a challenge. We do have some soil-borne pests. Root knot nematodes are probably the worst. Cornstalk borers, sweet potato weevil actually attacks the sweet potato that's growing underground. White grubs are something that we have in our soil. There are lots of, it's a beetle larva, several different kinds of beetles. They infect our turf grass too, but they chew on the roots of plants underground. Cutworms live sort of in the soil, right directly under the soil. They can come up at night. They come up at night. So if you're not out there in the dark, you may not see them. And they can chew your plant off right at the ground. Next morning you come up and come out and your plants are all laying over. This is the culprit. And you may need to, dig around. Make sure you don't have those in the soil. Wireworms can feed on roots too. And slugs. Not everybody has slugs, but snails are also becoming a really bad pest in Pinellas County. And there are baits out there that you can buy that are chemical baits. If you don't want to use those, and I don't think I would want to use them in my garden, there are some that are not quite so bad. Diatomaceous earth is a powder-like substance that's from diatoms that are these little ocean creatures. They're microscopic ocean creatures that have a silica-like skeleton, and they mine this stuff from the ocean floor, and it feels like talcum powder to us, but when snails or slugs crawl over it, the little spikes from these silica particles puncture their bodies and they dry up. So diatomaceous earth works well It is not the diatomaceous earth, though, that you buy for your pool filter. Don't use that. Buy it from a lawn care place because they're different. The pool one has some other chemical things in it that you don't want in your vegetable garden. Cornstalk borers, you can sometimes use BT on those, but you may have to inject it with a syringe. You may have to do that for squash borers too, to be able to kill them. You need to watch, see where they are. Nematodes are round microscopic worms, and they infect the roots of your plants. They're most damaging to tomato beans, cucumbers, and okra, but they will attack a lot of our other plants that are in our garden too. They cause galls and kind of swollen areas on the roots. The roots then become clubbed. They don't function as well, so they're not absorbing water and nutrients for the plants. There is some evidence that Better Boy tomatoes are resistant to nematodes, and there's a California black-eyed pea it's number 5 that is resistant to nematodes. So both of those are good ones to plant in our gardens, because especially if you know you already have nematodes. But there are some other strategies that you can use. Crop rotation, we've already talked about, where you group your crops by family and move them around your garden plot every season so that they're not in the same place. You may plant a group of plants like your okra plants one year in one spot, and that's something that's very sensitive. And you may want to plant broccoli plants there which are not quite so sensitive the next season and move your okra somewhere else. That allows the nematodes not to build up sufficiently in the soil. Heavy applications of organic soil amendments has been shown to moderate nematodes. We talked briefly about the fact that there are some beneficial nematodes in that compost that can attack the bad nematodes, but they also feel like it's because it improves the fertility and water holding capacity of the soil, and this in fact helps the plant to absorb things better even though they may be infected with the nematodes. Research has shown that red plastic mulch kills nematodes. And that's good, since tomatoes, it benefits tomatoes, and tomatoes are one of those plants that are adversely affected by nematodes. Growing marigolds over your garden during the summer when you don't have other plants can kill those nematodes within their roots and reduce the population in your garden. So it suppresses the buildup of them in the soil. There are a lot of beneficial insects out there. Ladybugs, their larvae especially, are ravenous. Green link spider, this one's eating a moth. Honeybees are extremely important in our garden for the fact that they are the pollinators. However, a lot of the stuff that you have read about the colony collapse of bees makes you think that there's no other pollinators out there. But there are lots of other pollinators. We have a lot of native bees, bumblebees, mason bees that are also pollinators. So the honeybees are not the only pollinators. Lacewings, green lacewings and brown lacewings, praying mantis, also a good beneficial insect, dragonflies. Here's a hornworm that's been parasitized. See all these little white things sticking up on it? You may see one that looks like that. It's a small braconid wasp that lays its eggs on the back of a tomato hornworm, and then they create these little cocoons and turn into new braconid wasps. In the meantime, they consume the hornworm. So kills it. That's a good thing. When you see that, that's a good thing to see. And you might want to move the hornworm off of your tomato plant, but leave it living somewhere else, because it's going to produce all those new braconid wasps that are going to be beneficial in the long run. You want to be sure that you're being kind to these beneficial insects in the whole rest of your landscape. If you're keeping pesticides out of your garden, but spraying the rest of your landscape for pests, you're in effect maybe reducing the numbers of beneficial insects. So you want to be cautious in your whole landscape and use IPM. Only spray when necessary, and only spray those plants that are affected. a lot of our landscape maintenance companies will come in and spray prophylactically. They'll spray the whole landscape with an insecticide, saying, well, something may come along. Well, first of all, that insecticide does not always persist in the landscape, and it may not be there when the insects come along, but you may have killed all your beneficial insects in the meantime. So be cautious with what's going on in the rest of your landscape, and then be aware that maybe your neighbors are killing beneficial insects on other sides of you. So you have to be cautious about that and know that some of the things that you do. And also, the reason I put the black swallowtail larva out here is if you're using BT in your garden and you have a butterfly garden nearby, you need to be careful that there's no drift or that you're very cautious with this, because BT also kills butterfly caterpillars. So you need to be careful with it. And if you have parsley in your garden that that you may be sharing with the swallowtail larva, be careful with BT. A few diseases. Some of the common diseases is when you have new seedlings. One is called damping off fungus, and this is where you'll see your seedlings growing up nice and healthy, and all of a sudden they all are falling over. And this is a fungus that's in the soil. It's usually a fusarium, but there are some others that will attack the stem right at the soil line, and then the plant just falls over. Powdery mildew. In our spring, sometimes this is a problem where we have really cool nights and maybe some humidity in the air during the day. You'll see powdery mildew forming. Rust, it's common on beans. It's a fungus that makes these little yellow spots. It starts out as yellow spots, and then they may turn orange and have kind of, if you rub the leaf, the orange spores come off on your hand. Blossom end rot. You see that with tomatoes and sometimes peppers. Tomatoes especially can get early blight and late blight. Both of these are fungal diseases where you start seeing these kind of concentric brown circles on the leaves. You'll see part of the leaf dying, turning brown. It always starts at the bottom of the plant and starts moving up. And once it gets to the top, the plant's dead. You may still have fruit ripening on it, but basically you're not going to get any more fruit. You can control most of these fungal diseases with fungicides. Neem oil will work as an alternative to using some of the other fungicides. There are fungicides on the market that are considered safe. You can also use elemental copper. You need to be careful and watch what it says on the label, though, because sometimes it'll say how long you can spray before you can harvest. Because it may be a week, it may be 10 days, so that if you spray on this day, you can't really eat any of your harvest or harvest it until 10 days later. You need to pay attention to that. This is something that is really a problem here in Florida. It's called tomato leaf curl virus, and it's spread by a little plant hopper, and it's also called tobacco leaf curl virus. In areas where they grow tobacco, it's really a real problem. It's the same virus. You can't cure it. Once your plant has it, it's not going to do well. The new growth are the ones that you will see curling up like this, and there's not a lot of resistant plants out there. You need to watch the weeds in the area where your garden is, because usually the plant hoppers are living in those weeds. And so you need to keep weeds down, not only in your garden but around your garden, to help with that. I have found, though, that sometimes even the ones that you bring home, if you're buying tomato transplants, they may already have it, because like I said, I grow things inside my pool enclosure. The only problem I have in there is whiteflies. And I use yellow sticky cards, which whiteflies don't like, or they like yellow, and if you use sticky cards, the adults fly to it, and eventually you don't have any more whiteflies. But I get this tomato leaf curl virus. The sweet 100s, the little cherry tomatoes, seem to be resistant. So occasionally you may get cherry tomatoes that do okay, but for the most part, it's a real problem. And once you have it in your garden, you probably have a plant out there that's that's supporting these leafhoppers that are carrying the virus. It is a real problem, and there's not a whole lot we can do about it. We talked about not having a or a pest-free garden because it's not likely to happen, so it's not necessary. You just want to manage it. You want to scout your garden. You want to see what's there, see if you need to be doing some kind of treatment. If you have a disease, if you have one plant that has powdery mildew and it looks pretty bad, but you have 6 others, you may just want to remove that plant and not let it be a source of infection for the rest. So you may want to do that. Use the least toxic methods first, try those first, and be careful using chemical pesticides. They will tell you whether you can use it in your garden. They will tell you exactly how to dilute it, how often you can spray it, when you can harvest after you spray it. It's extremely important if you use chemicals to do that, and follow it to the letter because it is the law. Following that pesticide label is the law. Now, we probably don't have any pesticide police out there watching you, but the research that those companies have done have determined what is the best concentration to use. Using more than that doesn't do better. Sometimes it's worse. Fertilizer, we talked a little bit about this, but you can put a good general fertilizer or balanced fertilizer over your whole garden prior to planting it. Dig it in and do that maybe right before you plant. And then once your plants start growing, you're going to want to add a little more fertilizer because they use a lot during their growing, because they're growing fast and they need those nutrients to be available. And you can band it on either side of the row of plants or around the plant. If you only have a single plant, be sure you use slow release. That's really the most important. Summer soil treatment. Solarization is something you can do that will cut down on soil pests and on nematodes because it heats up the soil. And we've got one here where first you prepare the soil, wet it, cover it with visqueen, which is a heavy, clear plastic, not black plastic. It needs to be clear plastic because the sun needs to be able to get through to the soil. You need to seal the edges either with soil if it's on the ground, or this one, I think John has a little board around the edge holding that plastic close to the soil. And then you leave it on for about 6 weeks. 8 weeks is even better if you can. Black-eyed peas, John's already talked about that. It's best if you till them in before they flower if you want to add that nitrogen to the soil. But even if you let them grow all summer and harvest the black-eyed peas and then till them in, it's still good for the soil. Or you could plant sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes grow all summer here. You plant them in May and harvest them in October, and you'll have beautiful sweet potato vines all over the soil. And it'll keep down weeds, but you're not adding anything to the soil during this process. You're actually taking away from the soil as the sweet potatoes grow. But it just depends. If you like sweet potatoes, it's a good option. Just one more time, Vegetable Gardening in Florida. This is probably the best book you'll ever spend money on. It only costs, I think it said on here, $16.95. It'll be the best $16.95 you ever spent if you're doing vegetable gardening, because it's really, it addresses almost everything. Thank you for watching this program on vegetable gardening in Pinellas County. For more information, you can visit the website that you see on our screen, or call our Lawn and Garden Help Desk at 582-2110. We also answer email questions sent to hort@pinellascounty.org. Extension presents a lot of programs on a variety of topics throughout the year. You can access our calendar by going to pinellascounty.org/events to find our upcoming programs.